going to be talking about the way Goldsboro received the people from away.
From the beginning, the people of this peninsula who settled in Squided villages were of two minds about the folks from the westward, especially the folks from Boston. They had a kind of a push-pull view of, you might call it a love-hate attitude toward and the settlers had their own idea. They wanted to look for land. They wanted to build a life of their own. But they were tied by sea to Boston and the West. And these are some of the ships that they sailed at this time. This is in about the 1760s and 70s. This is about the 1790s and 1800s. This is about 1810. They needed this connection because they barely could feed themselves. In fact, they were pretty much dependent on Boston. So this, they felt a little bit dependent. And they had hard lessons to learn when the chips were down because they were cut off during the Revolution and during the War of 1812, and all those ships never came. There was nobody coming. All of a sudden, they were stuck on their own, and this, they learned self-reliance, but at the same time, there was resentment at the fact that no help was coming. And so what about those people to the west? What about those Bostonians? This, in fact, directly led to the secession from Massachusetts and independence for Maine, this kind of an attitude. So next. So trade is essential. Timber and then fish. Trade, however, means tradesmen. Deals and exchanges had to be made. Had to put people up and put up with them. So, especially in substantial trade centers such as the county seats, for example, in the county seat of Machias and Castine, those were county seats, so there was an inn. This one is still standing. That's the Burnham Tavern in Machias. Very early, 1770s, Bucksport, a center, a depot for trade up to Penobscot. This is the Jed Prouty Inn, and I guess that's still standing too. I believe it still is. Bangor House, 1837. So big towns, occasionally some places for people to stay, and especially, so these were some of the first places to furnish but what about smaller towns next? For example, what about the Squided Peninsula? It's kind of a dead end, you might say, and yet there's an ocean highway connecting it to the rest of the world. So they had to deal with those traders and sell timber and fish, and they had to and especially before the Civil War era, however, there never was, we don't have any record of a building or any kind of an inn that was set up especially. So best we can, how will people put up? What are they going to do with those tradesmen? Maybe they could put them on board ship. They'll bring their own ships. They're going to live there, or they'll take them in somebody's homes. Best answer comes from a diary from this gentleman. This is Dr. Nathaniel Pendleton of Winter Harbor, but he covered all the way to Prospect Harbor. He got around, and he was definitely part of a lot of deals that were made. He wrote a diary, an amazing diary that's in the Winter Harbor Historical Society, or the transcripts of it. It records daily what happened during especially the 1850s, 1860s. We learned from this a lot about how people were dealt with, how trade was conducted. And he took in tradesmen on his own. If he made deals with somebody, he brought them into his own house. It was obviously pretty common to do that. Even when he made trips abroad, he would go off to Bangor and he would stay with somebody else in somebody else's house. So even with the Bangor house there, lots of people just didn't particularly use inns before the Civil War. So some of the, so this is how, this is kind of the daily story. But what about other travelers? There would be other travelers too. Back in that day, actually, my great-grandfather took a rowing expedition from Boston to Bangor, and he had no place to stay. He would stop every night. He would stop and stay with a farmer, such as along the shore, like a house like this. If he had come a little farther east, he would have stayed at the bunker house over in Winter Harbor, which is of that same era. Well, that's the kind of traveling that people did back in that time. Next. And then there's the county road. The county road, well, finally there's a road to connect things. It was a terrible condition originally. Everybody depended on the ocean at first. But eventually it was built up. This is more or less today's Route 1. Built by a levy, the state, the county had its own tax system. So you would be taxed not only for your property by the town, but also by the county. And you would have to pay some money or pay some labor or material. So this is another part of Dr. Pendleton's diary. He shows up on the highway and he spends a couple of days banging away on the highway. Gradually then we get a highway that some of the traders and travelers will come to, and here they are in West Bay, which was the center of town before the Civil War. West Bay was actually the townhouse was there, the principal church and meeting house was there, and from an fairly early time, we have this inn, the Bayview House. That starts up after the Civil War, and there it is up on the top of the hill. This is, you can see that it's really been not that much woodland even at that time. So what's kind of fun about this is to take a look at some of the traffic here. Here are some of these buggies. Here are some four-wheel little buggies and short buggies, little two-wheel buggies. The Dr. Pendleton used a two-wheel buggy to go down dirt roads and back roads all the way down to Squided Point and elsewhere. And here they are on the highway with these little gigs, and then this is this Surrey's with a little bit more of a top here, and here's a full-size coach. So this is the kind of traffic you get before the Civil War. Next. This same building stayed on until after the Civil War with a new owner named Fred Bartlett. The top of the hill, right there at Tuttle's store, that's still known as Bartlett's Hill. And even though he's long gone, the building was pretty much torn down in the 20s. Although there's a similar building right across from the Gouldsboro Historical Society headquarters. Next. So Prospect Harbor. Prospect Harbor pretty much takes over becomes the next center of trade. In fact, Prospect Harbor in the 1830s decided that they would like to secede from the rest of the town of Gouldsboro, and they put in for it, but the motion never carried. It never happened. But there was an inn right after the Civil War that's still there. There's a building that's still there. This is Aldo Marco's house. It's now bright blue. And this is the other view of it. This is what it was like when it was a hotel with a fancy gingerbread front like that. It was more or less the drummer's hotel for tradesmen, workers, and all kinds of people from away. There's particularly notable here was for boarding teachers. Teachers were more or less paid part of their salary was to be boarded in somebody's house or hotel. They were mostly from elsewhere. I guess they'd say from away, or at least they were Mainers, but a lot of them were not local folks. They had to be boarded somewhere, and it would often be the Cleves Hotel. Other folks coming through with the traveling, here we've got the register for a traveling theater company. There's the whole list. If you could see that, you'd see the names are definitely not local. They're folks from away, but they're doing dramatic melodramas for the folks in Prospect Harbor. Thursday, the rag picker's child. Friday, the price of shame. And Saturday, the struggle for justice. So maybe if you could read this carefully, you would like to assign a role to each one of these people. Anyway, this is the kind of, this is a very busy place and remains so well into the early 20th century. Next. And what else? Fish factories. Fish factories, probably the second big investment from the outside world that happened in the peninsula towns. The first investment was with the proprietors that set up the whole property system. But this fish factories brought laborers, a lot of them from elsewhere. How to put them up? Some of them were mariners also who would show up, and a boarding house. There's another building still here. This one is the bunker house in South Gouldsboro. It's a little bit later, this actual photo. I kind of like this photo. This is a real house full, I think. We've got Mom and Pop and 3 maids here. And then we got, 13 guys jammed into this house. I wonder how many per bed. In any case, dances were held in a place like this. So this is the kind of place to put up people who were working in factories and laborers and such. Next. And now Winter Harbor. Winter Harbor becomes a center as well, but it doesn't have factories. It becomes a trade center, and it has tradesmen and mariners, a lot of fishing traffic. Some of the biggest fishing schooners sailed out of there. And so right after the Civil War, 1870 to 1876, there was this building is still here. Right now they've refurbished the whole thing in back. You probably have seen how they've extended it, reshingled it. It was originally known as the Eureka Hotel. And this building is kind of a witness to a really important transition that happened during this period from the 1870s on into the mid-1880s. All of a sudden, things began to change. This was the year that the original, along came Edward J. Hammond, Hammond Hall. He was a successful local boy who came in with and started building big buildings and investing. He wanted to make a little settlement. Also, David Flint, a Bostonian Unitarian minister of sorts, with a lot of money. He bought this hotel and named it the Hotel Hanover in 1888. That was the critical era. In 1884, the railroad came down to Bar Harbor and connected and brought in hordes of people into Bar Harbor. All of a sudden, there was a big demand for land in the Bar Harbor area, and that extended all the way into our local area. And all of a sudden, people were buying property to sell for summer vacationers throughout in the mid-1880s. So at that point, this becomes a hotel for tourists for the first time. It was part of a vision of Winter Harbor that was the center of town, was intended to be the sort of the resort center. Nobody had taught anything about Grindstone at that point. So that's kind of a critical turning point, and we're going to be seeing some of the other buildings and hotels that take advantage of that great big surge next. So here's in neighboring Sullivan. Here's a hint as to what's about to happen to this region. This is called the Walkhead House. And here's the house as it was originally in the 1870s or so. And there's a record of Charles Elliott, the landscape architect who came here in the 1870s and ate there and so on. And now, by the 1880s and 90s, here's a flood of tourists. This is kind of what's about to threaten the rest of it. We're on the eve then of because many of the summer rusticators, some of the traditional summer people, didn't. They were really seeking something a little less noisy than this. So on the eve of this surge, or you might say an onslaught of tourism in the Gouldsboro neighborhood, what would a traveler find? We'd like to know. Well, who's going to take in folks from away? What kind of, let's look at a typical village inn that described to us by Mary Lou Hodge, our curator emeritus. And
tell you about the Wayside Inn. About 1829, Ebenezer Wood purchased a large tract of land on the north side of Jones Pond, near the outlet from the pond to Jones Cove. Next. There it is. There was a house on the property which had been built for Abijah Jones, son of Nathan Jones, one of the 3 original land grant recipients of Gouldsboro. Next. No expense was spared in building the house. An interesting example of early American architecture. The builder was a Mr. Cobb of Boston, who came to West Gouldsboro to work on the project. Next. Much of the interior finishes were handmade by the builder. Example, the stair rail and the fireplace. Hand-carved in delicate moldings and using 3-foot wide pine boards for the wainscoting in the dining room. The windows in the parlor were furnished with blinds that folded up inside the casings. Next. The inn had 22 rooms and 7 open fireplaces. The first floor consisted of 4 large rooms, dining room and living room on the northeast side, large front parlor and bedroom on the southwest side, separated by a spacious hallway with stairs leading to the second floor. The second and third floors housed the sleeping chambers. A large L with kitchen and pantry led to the barn and carriage house. Because Ebenezer had 3 wives during his lifetime and fathered 14 children, he had need for spacious home to accommodate any and all. Next, please. When Ebenezer's health began to fail, he turned the house over to his 6th son, Samuel. And this is Samuel, here in the dark corner. This is his wife, Emmeline, and this is their daughter, Grace. And I think you remember seeing a drawing of this clock earlier. Samuel, who after the death of his parents decided to take in summer boarders, because the site of the Wayside Inn was at the western entrance to the Gouldsboro Peninsula, many of the travelers to the area found it convenient to stay there, having heard nothing but good reports of the fine hospitality of the family. Next. Gouldsboro Historical Society is in the possession of 4 of the inn's registers, and if you want, after the program, there are copies of registers from both Wayside and Bayview and Cleves House at the back that you could look at. Among the guests, one will find the names of company representatives, traveling entertainers, as well as those of friends and neighbors who attended special occasions that took place there. The Historical Society also has the fireplace set shown in the drawing of their fireplace, which appears in the book, The Ancestry and Descendants of Ebenezer Wood. Samuel provided entertainment for his guests on occasion, having a fine baritone voice and an aptitude for playing the bass violin. His daughter Grace accompanied him on the organ or piano. Grace lived at home until she was 18 years of age when she attended Eastern Maine Conference Seminary in Bucksville, where she earned her teaching certificate. In 1904, the Daughters of Liberty published Historical Researches of Gouldsboro, Maine, which Grace had researched and written the previous year, that served as Gouldsboro Historical Society's original historical work about Gouldsboro. The inn was sold outside the family in 1917 to Frank Crowhurst, who continued to run it until it burned to the ground in 1936. It's been my pleasure to tell you about my great-great-grandfather Ebenezer and his Wayside Inn. Also, if you look at an exhibit at the back, it has Ebenezer's family tree, and there may be some names of other folks that you may recognize, some relatives of his.
And if you want to know what happened to the last owner of the Wayside Inn, it was Frank Crowhurst, and read all about it in the last chapter of Charles Story's book.
Back again. We're going to return to Winter Harbor, and we must remember that Winter Harbor was part of Goldsboro until 1895, and the most of the material that I'm about to show you, I'm dependent very much on Alan Smallage and his very excellent book about the entire history of Winter Harbor, Mosquito Harbor. We have here the Serene Cottage. It was run by Captain Charles Guptill and his wife. The Serene Cottage was among the first known tourist accommodations in Winter Harbor, and it looked over the entrance to the inner harbor and the ferry wharf. The Serene Cottage operated as a rooming house with a dining room until the mid-20th century, and its many famous visitors included Mrs. Leland Stanford, who's mentioned here. Her husband, a former governor of California, Mrs. Stanford was from California, endowed Stanford University as a memorial to his son who had died at the young age of 15 of typhoid fever. Thanks. Here we see the Beacon Hotel. It was a summer resort furnished with all the latest accommodations. It tells us here that it had electric bells, gas, pure water piped from a spring located in back of the Greenwood Cemetery, a spacious dining room, and a tennis court. Communication with Bahama by a new steamer named the Winter Harbor was every 2 hours. And the Boston and Maine Railroad could get people here from Boston in 8 hours, and the New York railroads could bring people in 15½ hours to Winter Harbor and the Beacon Hotel. The Beacon opened on July 1, 1888, and could accommodate 150 guests, the first of whom arrived on the 10th of July in 1888. Next. After 3 seasons, in the early morning of June 14th, 1891, the Beacon burned. Some of the developers of Grindstone Neck, who had stayed at the Beacon, including John Dallas Dixon and John G. Moore, made plans there to form the Goldsboro Land Improvement Company, and very soon after that, the second largest and fanciest hotel, the Grindstone Inn, came into being. The Grindstone Inn was built in 1891. It had 50 guest rooms, far fewer than the 150-room Beacon, but with many more modern conveniences and amenities. It was enlarged in the 1930s to 125 rooms. The Grindstone Inn was indeed the quintessential resort hotel of the era, thriving from the 1880s through the 1920s, in decline a little bit in late 1930s and 1940s, and eventually, October 27th, 1856, the Grindstone Inn burned to the ground in a furious conflagration, as Alan tells us in his book. It was located where the tennis courts are today at the top of Grindstone Inn. Next. Here we have the Frenchman Bay Lodge, John Moore's Far from the Wolf Cottage. It was run by Isabel Farnsworth and Jane Miller in the 1950s and 60s, and Sandy Pippin, a well-known local writer, wrote a book about the Frenchman Bay Lodge called Kitchen Boy. Obviously, it is still standing and is still quite a commanding presence in Grindstone Neck. And if anyone is interested, it is once again on the market for the mere price of $3.5 million. Moving on to Prospect Harbor, we have the Sands Inn. I'm sorry, Alan, could you go back? I want to get to that later, but there were other accommodations available in Winter Harbor that we do not have slides for, and I just wanted to mention them briefly. The Eureka House, which later became the Hanover Hotel, Alan has already told you about. There was the Winter Harbor Inn that first opened in 1896 by Preston Joy and his wife, and was operated by Edna Roberts during the first half of the 20th century. There was the Argo Inn, operated during the 1930s through the 1950s managed by Edith Dyer. And in the middle of the century, the Squided cabins at the end of Sargent Street facing the ocean were another popular destination for people from away with less substantial means. Now we can go on to Prospect Harbor. We move on to Prospect Harbor and the Sands Inn. The Sands Inn is on the Korea Road in Winter Harbor. It was locally run by local people and was ideally located to offer all the comforts of home. It had home-prepared food. It was a welcome haven, and for people who like living next to nature. Next slide. Here we have a page from the Sands Register, which I'm not expecting you to be able to read, but there were many guests there from away. They tell us there were people from Minnesota and Massachusetts and many other parts of Maine. People from Maine like to take advantage of the sea breezes and the natural surroundings and the home-prepared food that was offered to guests during the summer season. 100 yards from the Sands house is, quote, one of the finest bathing beaches on the coast of Maine, close quote. Remember, it's 1920. And we see here some people who were enjoying with and without proper bathing attire. Next slide. Here we get a better view of the beach. That's the house and the beach. And recently, the Sands has become the setting of another beachside resort, the Oceanside Meadows Inn. Is operated by Ben and Sonia, who have joined us this evening. And they held their wedding ceremony on this beach, and I'm not revealing the year. Next slide. This is the Lobster Inn in Korea. It was a local enterprise that featured shore dinners in the 1920s. These signs, by the way, are from our extensive Gouldsboro Historical Society Museum collection. Unfortunately, we do not know the proprietors at the time, and if anyone here happens to remember who was running it and owned it this time, we appreciate finding out. The building is still there, but it has been enlarged and would be hard to recognize. Next slide. Our final slide in this segment shows the Ash Farm returning to West Goldsboro and on the Taft Point Road. Was operated as a guest house during the 1940s and 1950s, and visitors could enjoy, again, farm fresh food, locally produced food, and it provided summer employment for many local girls, and the buildings are all still there. And you got the next slide.
So with that, we come to the idea that possibly some of us used to work in some of these places. I used to be a kitchen boy, not in this town. I know some other people here who worked in some of these places. I wonder if any of you might know anybody who does, for example. I know somebody who used to work at the Ash Farm.
I did work at Ash Farm. In my high school years, we won't say what years those were, but Amelia was as you see there, the lady on the left. And she pretty much ran it herself after it was established during the, about the time of the Great Depression, 1931, with her husband who died within a few years. Her sister Annie, her twin sister in the picture, came to help her out, and later on her brother Bill came. They had their own cows, their own gardens. She made bread 3 times a week. She cooked steaks on a wood stove by lifting the lid and putting a grill on it. She did baked Alaska in the oven. She grew the flowers for the table, crocheted the tablecloths and placemats, had a multitude of different dishes and settings, and had people from different locations that came. Maybe the most prominent during my time was Howard Simpson, who was president of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, and they spent most of the summer there. Some of the other guests came and went, and there were 3 of us who worked there that are now Historical Society members, and I know Mary Lou Hodge has her version.
I'll tell you what the girls did. They did everything except cooking. They made beds, changed linens, cleaned bathrooms, set the table, and waited on the table. You got 2 hours off in the afternoon where you could run down to Jones Pond, take a quick dip, and then come back and be ready, set the table for dinner. It was, you were busy. We'll put it that way. Yes.
Question, do you happen to know what the rent or the cost was to spend the night there?
I don't remember, I'm sorry.
We didn't see those slips.
No.
We only saw the food slips.
Mary Lou also worked at the Frenchman Bay Inn, and probably can attest that Sandy Pippin's novel is, you can, I believe you can identify every one of the characters.
It really happened.
Right. Anybody else who ever worked in one of these places? It would be kind of fun to hear. I know that Ben and Sonia, of course, have the most experience in doing this firsthand, and people here. Is it true that you wore a kilt to your wedding on the beach?
That's right.
And Sonia, you were probably in
Yes, sorry.
of course. Must have been very colorful. What was the, and kilt, and what, pipes were playing?
They were indeed. And what was extraordinary, my wife's uncle was not well and lived in Germany, couldn't attend, and he wrote a poem. He asked people to contribute to the wedding ceremony, and he wrote a poem not knowing what we were going to wear on our wedding day, and he entitled the poem "When a Sari Meets a Kilt." Sort of speaking of how much these places cost, we do have a little brochure which I see pictured on one of your slides, a page of it.
Well, I stole it from your website.
Yeah.
Of course.
Oh really? Oh, jolly good, right. Well, it says that firstly you had to send a letter with 2 references to Mrs. Shaw. A letter of application, it said, to apply to come for the summer season. And I heard that she would sit down with all these letters of application and decide who would fit well together to stay for the summer season. And it was $3 a day, including all meals.
Yeah.
Wow.